Okay, in this video, we're really going to dial in and actually talk about blocking in, what that means procedurally, what that means from technical aspects, what kind of values you're going to use, what kind of lines are appropriate for that level of design, and really talk about, what kind of goals we want to accomplish in this moment of the drawing. It's of course an incredibly important moment. We hear all the time that block-ins are kind of the foundation for what the rest of the drawing will become. Of course, these concepts and these ideas also apply to how we're going to think about oil painting. And in the same way, your final painting is not likely to become much better on a fundamental design level than your block-in achieved. Let's start out first talking about the goals that we have to create a good block-in drawing. First of all, we're going to be looking at proportion. What we're talking about here really is height versus width, or at least that's the most basic explanation you can make about what proportion is. That proportion, though, going from height to width in its broadest sense, can also be broken down into smaller and smaller increments. We can talk about the height and width of the head overall. We can talk about the height and width of the shadow shape of the eye. So all of these things scale in the sense that we can start very broad and move to something very specific. And we'll be focusing on it from the beginning of the drawing all the way until the end of the drawing. The second thing that I want to talk about as far as goals are concerned is construction. What we want is a believable three-dimensional model of the portrait that we're drawing. Some of the tools that we're going to use to achieve that sense of three-dimensionality are going to be contour lines and how those contour lines can overlap one another, and also an organization of shadow, light, and halftone. Using these very simple and basic technical tools, we should be able to render a design for the head that is three-dimensional and also somewhat naturalistic looking. The third and maybe most nebulous of the three priorities that we're going to have in this drawing is going to be to achieve a great level of design. Of course, we have to define then what we mean by design and how design can be increased in its quality and decreased in its quality. For my purposes here, I like to think about design in terms of creating dynamic shapes. I think it's easiest to understand this when you kind of compare a dynamic shape to a more static shape. So if we take, for instance, a rectangle and compare that to a shape with more angle breaks and a stronger sense of gesture going from one side to the other, we can get a sense of a comparison between static and dynamic design. The shapes that we tend to find in nature when we're translating them into two dimensions will usually have a stronger dynamic sense than they will a static sense. So throughout the course of the drawing, when we begin with our initial kind of blocky design shapes, we're going to be continually refining and elaborating on those shapes until we reach that level of dynamism that is appropriate for the portrait that we want to make. So let's reiterate those three goals here: proportion, construction, and design. Each one equally important, and each one is going to require a different kind of focus and application. So when focusing on proportion, one of the main things that I try to do technically is to make sure that my drawing is infused with straight lines and angle breaks. Now this can be also somewhat of an aesthetic choice, but for me also it's highly practical. So when I have a set of straight lines that are meeting together at an angle break, those straight lines and that angle break as a point in a two-dimensional space serve as a reference to all the other points throughout the drawing, so that each time I add another angle break and another line segment, I'm cross-referencing on a vertical and horizontal axis the other reference points around it. Now, as I say this, I've made it sound very, very scientific, and as if I do it for every single line segment that I make. The truth of the matter is you do it as often as you think of it, which should be really relatively often for the early stages of a drawing. It's important to be a little bit mechanical and scientific in this way, but also to be a little bit of an artist yourself as well and allow yourself the time to kind of explore the shapes that you're making without constantly going back and double checking. So straight lines and angle breaks, again, serve as reference points that we can use to determine the gesture and proportion of other shapes and line segments surrounding them. So in terms of showing the construction or three-dimensional model for the head that I want to make here, there's a couple of things I mentioned to start out. The first was the idea of overlaps. Overlaps are a way to take a simple line segment or set of line segments and turn them from something two-dimensional into something that has a three-dimensional concept to it. What we're doing by creating an overlap basically is saying that one form is in front of the other form. So that when we're looking at, say, the shape of the eyelashes in relationship to the contour of the side of the head, by overlapping one line segment over the other, I've created a successful indication of the depth in between those two parts of the subject. The other thing that we're going to use in order to indicate this three-dimensional structure is to use unified planes of value. I've chosen for this drawing more or less a three-value structure. So we will have the value of the shadows, we'll have the value of the halftones, and we'll have the value of the highest key light shapes. Using those three values and incorporating them in an accountable way into the underlying wireframe that I developed in the initial block-in, I should be able to make a reference to what the form of the head is specifically in relationship to the light source. So for our sense of construction, we are going to be looking to use overlaps and a three-value structure to help us indicate the three-dimensional form of the head in an accountable and accurate way. So in terms of designing shapes, one of the critical factors in beginning this process is to accept that there's a translation taking place in between 3 dimensions and 2 dimensions, and that in that translation, some information is going to be edited away. So when I look at the shapes of the hair, I can, with my eyes, see, of course, all of the myriad detail that's taking place there. For the sake of what a block-in is and what my goals are within that block-in, I'm going to strip away most of that information in order to determine a scheme or a blueprint for the 2-dimensional model that will show the shapes of the subject in this 2-dimensional paradigm that I'm working in. There are a couple different features that I look for in my initially very detailed source image. One of the first organizational structures that I use to kind of sift through all of the detail is to look at the shadow and light orientation. Given that we have that primary dominant light source, our subject is going to be split up into 2 different areas. One, areas that are being touched by that direct light source, and then 2, an area that is being hidden away from it. This can take place through form shadows or cast shadows. Either way, the dividing line in between those 2 areas is a useful scheme by which I can start to organize my visual information. By observing the figure through this lens, 2 different sets of design elements are revealed to me. The other set of shapes that I want to talk about are derived from the sense of halftone interaction within the light shape. So if we have a 3-value structure that we're working in, the first value will be consumed within the shadow shapes, and the other 2 values then will be available for use within the light shape. For me, I usually try to reflect on planes that reveal most the form. These planes are going to be large and very generic in a sense. So when we look at the side plane of the nose or the side plane of the cheek, for instance, I'm aware that there are multiple values. I want to choose the most generic and simple version of those value shapes. So what I'm going to do really is squint down and search for the unity in those planes. By doing so, I reveal again 2 sets of value shapes, each with a unique and interesting set of designs that I can apply to them. Your assignment in this moment is to get your paper stretched up and ready to be drawn on, acquire all the materials that you're going to need, whatever pencils and erasers that I'm using, have them sharpened up and ready to go, and then choose the source image from a model pack that you'd like to use to make your block-in drawing. It can be really important to remember that the first few marks that you're going to make on the paper, they're really not about being super definitive and super dark. What we want to do is just kind of get a few marks on the page that kind of arrange the head in space, which is kind of what I'm doing right now. It's really just kind of choosing where she's going to be located, and I think that's a really useful way to kind of start out your drawing. So often we kind of dive into even things like the shape of the entire head before we've even really worked out what its position on the paper should be. So here in these first moments, think about very light marks and also think a little bit about the composition. Feel free to take as much time as possible before you actually start to kind of frame the head within the paper. Because once you start to place a few features, maybe you have 10 lines, we're going to start to get really, really attracted to those 10 lines and committed to the time that we've put into it. So for me, I like to make sure that in this earliest moment, I'm making lines that in no way, shape, or form will I feel bad about getting rid of when the time comes. And so in this first stage, we want to take the time, as I'm doing now, to also just take a step back. I kind of placed the head in a way that I thought would be kind of useful, but eventually I don't like the proportion of it. I'm going to make a quick change just to make sure that eventually the drawing that I come up with in the end is going to be the drawing that I want. Really, we can talk a lot about the first stages of a drawing and say that really they are about a kind of foresight. The best decisions that we're going to make are usually going to be made when we have a kind of clear idea of the destination of our drawing. So the fact that I know that this drawing is going to be, for the most part, staying within a block-in stage means that I can kind of understand a little bit how much value I want to introduce, how much complexity I want to introduce. Really, all the subsequent choices and decisions that I make about this work are going to be made with that concept in mind. Now here, of course, we can say we just have a few lines, and so maybe that impact is not starting to be felt yet. But suffice to say, I do know that I have the time to make these changes because this drawing is going to be very limited in its scope of detail. So here we are. I've got a lot of the features on the paper. In fact, everything has really been represented in one way or another, excluding maybe some of the more peripheral features like her sweatshirt. What I have really on the paper right now is a lot of incorrect information that, though useful, I don't want to still kind of get married to, right? I want to kind of keep my distance and make sure that my lines are not becoming too definitive. I would suggest at this stage really that you try to keep your focus a little bit more so on the features and the actual structure of the head itself rather than maybe detail in peripheral areas. Looking, for instance, at the shapes of the hair on the upper left of the head or the lower left of the head, there is a world of complexity that is available to me there, but I would kind of rather focus on getting features that are kind of logically connected to one another to make sense in the drawing, which is to say that human anatomy affords us a kind of expected set of relationships. We can understand then that if those relationships work very well, they will become excellent reference points for all of the other shapes around it that are maybe not governed by such hard and fast relationships. I want to point out also something that you've been watching through this phase. If you notice all of the vertical and horizontal lines that I've drawn through this face, these are lines that I normally would have erased away right after I'd made them, or even for that matter, some of them I may not have drawn in the first place. I've put them in here to serve as a kind of real material example of the kind of comparisons that I'm making in between informational points in a drawing. To show, for instance, how the tear duct and the outside corner of the nostril correlate to one another on a vertical axis, and also to show how to interpret the curvature of the hair as it swings back and forth from left to right, to understand what the big gesture is as I run down that right-hand contour of the hair, and how these smaller turns and angle breaks are influenced by that large gesture. I also want to take this moment to just bring up what kinds of problems we can actually solve at this stage given the amount of information that we have on the paper. What we have at the moment are a series of contour lines that are surrounding shapes that are mostly visual, some structural. So there are shadow shapes that have a little bit of an outline, and there are also halftone plane turns that also have a little bit of an outline. I've organized these lines from being slightly lighter and wider and softer to being slightly darker and sharper. And this gives me a little bit of that sense of organization that is going to help me to kind of determine some of the questions that I'm about to ask. One of the things that I can arrange here is the tilt of the head. The tilt of the head, of course, is indicated by the angle at which each feature sits in relationship to its mirror on the other side. So we have a head that on the left-hand side is tilted a little bit downward, and so a little bit up on the right side. Looking at the line across the brow ridge, the line in between the tear ducts of each eye, the line in between the outside corners of each side of the mouth, all of these should be sitting along an axis that is tilted in exactly the same way, at least for the sake of this early moment of the drawing. I know that facial asymmetry is something that brings about a lot of character, but now is the time actually for creating a very standardized version of a symmetrical head. We can also look at how the features are placed in relationship to the center line. The further that her head turns to the right, the less of the right-hand side of the mouth that I'm going to see on the right-hand side of the center line, and the more of the left-hand side of the mouth I'm going to see if we divide it by that vertical center line. The same thing will take place with the eyes. The tear duct in the eye on the left will appear much further in two-dimensional space from the vertical center line, and the tear duct of the eye on the right will appear much closer to it. These are things that we can definitely control and make pretty clear assertions about at this moment of the drawing. It goes without saying also that the heights and widths of the head and all of the individual features inside of it are also up for grabs in terms of the amount of information we have on the paper being sufficient to make really good judgments, and so hopefully to come to a very good conclusion about them. Your assignment at home in your studios is to take a really in-depth look at the relationship in between the features on both a horizontal and vertical axis, and also to take a look at what the overall tilt of the head is, and to make sure that all of the features are aligned along the same tilting axis. Now that we've gotten to this place, there's a little bit stronger of a value statement in the drawing, which is to say that the shapes that I indicated with lines have now started to be kind of filled in with value, which gives them a little bit more a sense of kind of being a solid shape. And the solid edges to that shape then give us the possibility to look at the proportion of that shape and how the height versus the width can be kind of observed and controlled in a way that brings about a little bit more of an accountable sense of accuracy. In addition, I've started to put a lot more shapes into the hair. This is actually really a kind of joyous moment because the kind of flowing S-curves that come through the hair of this model in particular, and of course of other models, are really interesting to kind of follow from their origin all the way to their conclusion. And this is the way, in fact, I kind of developed the sense of shapes in between the highlights of the hair and maybe some of the darker, deeper recessed shadows of the hair. It's not only to draw the shape in isolation, but like I said a moment ago, to follow the hair from its origin all the way to its conclusion. And in that way, I think I tend to come across more dynamic and more unique shapes that kind of describe the flow and movement of that hair. There's also a slightly more complete picture of the composition at this moment, so I can start to judge overall what the kind of large shapes and large movements are in relationship to one another. The large arcing curve on the left-hand side of the head that is slightly flatter as it descends down towards the shoulder, and the more sort of wavy, flowing back and forth curvature on the right-hand side. I now have the opportunity to kind of compare one side to the other and look at the movement all the way from the beginning of that line on the lower left around to the conclusion of that contour, that silhouette, if you will, on the far right-hand corner. These are things that we don't really get to observe maybe until there's enough information on the paper, so it's worth noting right now that we're at a place where that's observable and therefore controllable. As I look at the drawing in this moment, I have to be completely honest and say that it could be a little bit more simple than what it is. For the kinds of problems that I'm still wanting to solve with this, I think that the nature or the elaborate nature of some of the shapes within the hair, for instance, or even in the features, are probably a little bit beyond the scope of my concern. This, of course, isn't the end of the world. It's just worth noting that the simpler you stay, the more control and the greater degree of flexibility that you possess in a drawing. And even this, which seems like a relatively simple drawing, for me, I think is, in a perfect world, a little bit too complex, even for this stage. We can also see, though, the beginning of the three-value structure that I talked about in the introduction to this video. It's starting to take shape, and if we look at the shadow below the ear on the left-hand side of the head and compare that to, say, the value of the down-facing plane of the cheek, also on the left-hand side of the face, we can see that those are roughly the two values that I've chosen, and now I need to make the shapes around the rest of the head kind of conform a little bit more to that structure. Of course, we have in this, since it's on white paper, the value of the paper that is omnipresent as that high key halftone value, rounding out the three-value structure that I'm trying to implement here. Your assignment at home in your studios is to find a shape that you can use to describe that darkest of the three values. Then find the subsequent shapes around the rest of the head that also should be described with that value. Once having done this, go through your drawing and find a shape to describe with the intermediate value. After you've filled in that shape, search for planes which are facing a similar direction and fill them in also with that same value. Having done all of this, it should mean that you have completed at least your first guess at what your three-value structure will look like. At the conclusion of this stage, what we're really looking for is a drawing that has a sense of being complete. Not all of the assumptions that we've made in this moment are going to be permanent, or even the solutions that we want to come up with in the end, and certainly we're not in a place where we find everything to be perfectly accurate. What we would like to have, though, is a sense of harmony that is guided by each shape being looked at with the same degree or the same level of scrutiny, so that there are not things that are simply put in place and not considered, and other things that are almost finished. We're trying to keep things all at the same level. Part of the benefit that we receive from keeping things at the same level is that comparisons from the top to bottom and side to side of the drawing are a little bit more accountable. We're seeing everything in a sense with the same eye. So even though there is a very large difference in between what our drawing looks like and what our source photograph looks like, at the very least within our drawing, the world that that is representing is similar enough to itself that there are comparisons that you're able to make that you wouldn't be able to make should the drawing be in a state of a little bit more chaos. I want to also reiterate here that those horizontal and vertical comparisons that I was making when adding shapes at the early stages of this drawing is still very much present in my mind. So that as I'm adding shapes and curvatures to different parts of the head, adding shapes into the hair, for instance, that I'm looking above them, below them, to the left and right of them, searching for angle breaks and other features that correlate to them along those axes. This spirit of comparison and almost scientific or mathematical search for correlation and relationship is critical to develop for the student. It represents, in a way, a new or different kind of thinking that we take into this approach to drawing than what we would as a naive, entry-level draftsperson. And so it's important then that we continue to talk about it, continue to put a name on it, so that it becomes something that, through practice and repetition, can be like a second nature to you. Eventually, the comparisons that we are taking great pains to remember to search for are going to be something that come quite naturally in your drawing process, the same way that using straight lines and clear angle breaks will, as long as you continue to practice them. Your assignment at home then is to act as your own quality control agent. Go through your drawing and ask yourself the question continually: have I simplified this shape or this contour? Is it a dynamic shape that I've created, not a static shape? Are there enough angle breaks here that correlate to other angle breaks in other areas and allow me to make the kinds of comparisons that will ensure a control over the degree to which I'm able to express accuracy and proportion within this drawing?